Hello and welcome back to Animal Imaginatomy. We're entering week 2 now. So last week we started understanding those construction forms of the quadruped, right? We talked a little bit about stalkers versus runners, and this week now we're going to build on that information and we're going to start expanding out. And this week is where we really start to kind of alter those forms and learn how to push those forms. This is where we start learning the imagine part of that imaginatomy, right? So we can utilize that in two different ways. The course at this point is going to kind of diverge depending on what you want to focus on. If you're more focused on real world wildlife, from this point on, you'll be working with pushing these construction forms and learning how they move, how these different forms interact with one another, where the flexion points are on these construction forms, etc. So basically learning how to manipulate these forms to work with a variety of different species. If you're more into conceptual things, right? You're looking to go into maybe concept design or fantasy art, you'll also have the option instead to go ahead and explore a little bit of creature design with these aspects. Learn how to push these forms a little bit further, maybe beyond real world, and incorporate in maybe some fantastical anatomy into it. So learning how to manipulate these into fantastical shapes rather than real world shapes that you can then manipulate. So again, at the end of the class, you'll kind of hear how we're going to address that through the different homework assignments. But for this lesson, let's go ahead and just hop into it here. We've got a lot of ground to cover, as I mentioned, in these very short 5 weeks. So I want to kind of hit the ground running on week 2. And we are going to go ahead, let me go ahead and get a darker value here. We're going to go ahead and start learning how to manipulate those forms like I mentioned. We'll be using a giraffe as the basis. So a giraffe is a running species. We talked about the difference between runners and stalkers. Stalkers get a little bit lower to the ground. They don't have such a pronounced chest. They don't have those locked in limbs. They can, for the most part, not all of them, obviously, there's always an exception to the rule, but for the most part, they can go ahead and pronate and supinate those wrists of theirs. Runners, however, have those a little more rigid and a little deeper chest, and they're made to kind of have that sustained impact on the ground with those limbs. So we'll be using a giraffe as the basis today to show you. I'll be using a giraffe as the basis today to show you how to alter these forms. So let's just go ahead and begin right off the bat here. I'm going to go ahead and just mark off a couple areas on the page here. There we go. And this is just like how we started it last time, right? I'm just getting a really loose gestural kind of skeletal rig in here. Just establishing big planes. And I'm really only using this reference that you guys can see off to the side for just that reference. I'm not really going to focus on it too much, and I am going to go ahead and alter it in a little bit here as we get further into the lesson to show you how to start manipulating those limbs and how to start lumping these muscle masses together. So with that in mind, don't do too much cross comparison with the reference here versus what I'm drawing. We will be getting to I will be getting to some areas that I'm observing quite closely from the reference, and I'll point that out. But for the most part, I'm just using it as a rough guide. I'm going to go ahead and let's see here. We're getting a little tight on space there with all the vertical height that we have on this creature. That I'm just going to shrink that body down just a little bit to make some space for us. There we go. Perfect. So now that I have that kind of rough skeletal rig established, I'm going to go ahead and start locking in our forms. We can go ahead and now, let me go ahead and actually do something really quick here. Just going to copy that layer and paste it back on. So if I need to alter that anymore, I can change that size more readily. Just one of those really nice things about digital mediums. It allows us to make those really quick changes when we need to. All right, there we go. Now I can go ahead and shrink that down, get a little more breathing room there. Perfect. So as I mentioned, now I'm going to go ahead and start draping those construction forms on this skeletal rig. I'm going to start building those forms out. If we remember, really quick review, we have that wedge shape that's going to work for the chest abstraction and for the shoulder muscles. We have that barrel abstraction that's going to be the midsection, and we have our saddle abstraction, which is going to make up the hips and the upper rear limbs. So with those in mind, remember that at the end of last week's lesson, how I mentioned that these shapes can be pushed, pulled, and distorted in many different ways. And by switching up those proportions, by switching up the relationships, the size relationships between these shapes, that's how we get our different species. That's how we're going to get our different creatures, our different monsters, our different space aliens or dragons or in the real world, the difference between a hyena and a dog and a domestic dog and a wild wolf, those little proportional changes are going to pay off big time at the end result. So pay very close attention to this next part as we start to get into these shapes. So to start with, we're going to go ahead and establish that wedge shape, right? That shoulder mass that we have where the neck hooks up. If we're looking at our reference, you can see the really clear plane right across here on the front. And then coming up here, right? You can see that really clearly on the reference. So pay attention to that little divot right here before it goes up to the neck on the reference. That's the corner, the very corner of that wedge shape. And we can see here too that it's slanted back fairly far, much further than we were doing on our canid last week, right? So you can already see how these small changes make quite a big difference in the creature type. It's the same shape, we're just altering it a little bit. We're just changing those proportions a little bit. Think about the difference in character that we get when we change the proportions on a construction form for a portrait drawing, right? Or we change the proportions on the construction forms for a figure drawing. We can get crazy variance in the form by switching up those construction forms. And remember, that's just we're working with one species when we're figure drawing. We're working with one species when we're doing portrait painting, Homo sapien, right? That's what we're drawing in those situations. Here, when we're drawing wildlife or when we're creating creatures that have not yet ever been seen, right? That's what concepting is. You're creating things that people haven't seen before. When we're drawing animals or creating creatures that haven't been seen, we have hundreds, thousands of different species that we're tackling. There's so many different form combinations that we can really get in here that it really pays to slow down and see just how much we can alter these construction forms to get a really fun variance between them. So we can already see here, like I mentioned, we have a very large wedge shape. That's taking up a very large section and the overall body of this creature. It's tilted back a little bit further than we had last week with the canid and increased in size, as I've already mentioned. Now as we go into the midsection here, we're actually going to do something a little bit different with the midsection than we did from the shoulder abstraction. As you can see with that midsection on the reference, it's much more squat than we had last week with our canid. So with that in mind, we want to make sure that we get that kind of short, truncated feel to it, but it's round. It's really round, right? What's going to help to get that roundness to it all is pulling through here, right? That chest split, the split in the pectorals right there, pulling through right on that split into that midsection. Find that center line to the chest and see how it syncs up right to that belly line. And then as we come over, you can see how that midsection is bulging outwards, right? It's very rounded. On a lot of ungulates, which is what this is. If you remember from last week, we went over those three terms for motion. Digitigrade, which means walking on their digits, basically walking on their toes like a dog would. Plantigrade, which is walking with your toes and your heel to the ground, like we do as humans, like bears do. And then there's ungulate, which is walking on their toenails. So this is an ungulate. They're walking on hooves. They have hooves. Those hooves are modified toenails. So on this ungulate, on a lot of ungulates, you get a very rounded midsection in here. And we can see here that we also get a bit of a raising up with that, right? So watching carefully to see those little variances in there and how they affect the overall form is something that I'm doing at this point in time. And I'm adding in a little bit more nuance to all this, right? So I went ahead and I locked in that midsection, but now I'm sectioning off this top area here. As I do that, I'm going to go ahead and alter that chest mass just a little bit too, to get a little more topography in there. There we go. Good stuff. I love drawing extreme forms like this, like giraffes and elephants and things. There's so much fun. It's all about pushing these construction forms, and you really get to see the versatility of these forms and how they support, how they really support the end result, the end drawing. All right, now as we're coming into here, we have that downward plane of the hips. Now we're looking back at those hips. We're not really seeing, if I'm going to go ahead and draw through, we're not really seeing much of that top plane because it's facing away from us. But we can go ahead and pull down, get that angle in there, right? That downward slope. You can see that downward slope as it comes in there. We have the spine coming across the back, which is throwing off that downward slope just a little bit. I'm going to show you how to deal with that in just a second here. But let's get that downward slope established. Get it a little more extreme. Again, with these very long-limbed animals, sometimes you get a little more extreme angles, like we have up there with that chest wedge. So we're dropping this down here, and then we're coming in with that saddle abstraction, right? That side area that comes down, that's going to work as the upper leg. We can go right across the other side. He's standing in a fairly neutral pose here. So drawing across the other side is absolutely allowed when we have a neutral pose like this. Locking up those limbs, it helps make sure nothing's really sliding around. There we go. Yeah, that's looking fun. Cool, so there we go. We got that nice backward slope to those hips. But what we want to do here, right up here, like I mentioned, altering these forms, getting a little bit of variance in these shapes. That's what we want to do. We want to watch for the subtleties here. So you can see, if you look really closely back there at that plane of the hips, you can see that drop down angle that I have right here. But if you're also looking at that, we see this area that comes across right up here, then comes down. That's an extension of the spine that's going back down and into the tail at that point in time. So that extension of the spine, we want to pull off of that midsection shape. So what we're going to do here, let me go ahead and shrink that so we can get it back on the screen. What we're going to do here is just come in and just pull that section a little bit further off and then drop it down. Now, a lot of ungulates have these really boxy shapes to them. Like I mentioned, they have those kind of big bellies. A lot of ungulates have a chambered stomach, so they get these really wide midsections. That barrel shape is particularly wide on ungulates. But they also have pretty boxy hips for the most part. So, so you get things like this. Oh, I'm sorry. So you get things like this happening over here, where you get that kind of boxiness to the tail as it drops down behind the hips. It's really nice because it adds a really great amount of depth to your drawing too. So I love putting those little areas in there. The more overlaps of these larger forms that we have, the more depth the drawing is going to have, the more three-dimensionality it's going to have come across in the final product. All right, now we've got our construction forms pretty much figured out here. They're all locked in. They look good. I'm happy with how they're going. But let's go ahead and get those limbs in now, right? So the limbs on this guy, we've got a giraffe, which again is an ungulate. It's a running species. It's made to cover far distances. I'm sorry, it's made to run fast, Not particularly over a great amount of distance, but it's made to outrun its predators, right? So with that in mind, we need to get those legs established in there. The legs also are another survival mechanism of these creatures, not just because they use them for running, but because they add to the overall height of this animal. Those legs work in tandem with that neck and that head that's held up high to have them watch out for predators and everything. So knowing that, we need to make sure that we get that extreme length in there. So I'm a huge proponent of understanding the why behind the features that you're drawing. If you understand why a creature has those evolutionary features, you're going to be able to better capture them in your drawing and in your artwork. You're not going to overlook it. You're not going to forget it. So with that in mind, I always kind of think about how these creatures survive, and then I look at their anatomy and kind of say, okay, I can't miss this piece of their anatomy because that's crucial to what makes this creature this creature. In this case, that height is crucial to what makes a giraffe a giraffe. So we're going to go ahead and make sure we get those legs extra long, really nice and long. So the structure of these legs, it's no different from the structure that we had for the equines on that first week's demo, remember? So for the running species, we did that little split, that side-by-side split, where you had one half as a canid and the other half of the legs were equine legs. Ungulate legs. Same sort of thing here. We're going to go ahead and utilize the same sort of legs that we did at that section. So as I was mentioning, right down here is where we're going to go ahead and connect that up. And if we remember from last week's lesson, this corner right here is the elbow. That's where we get the elbow happening on our quadrupeds. We're going to come on down here. We already have the overall length established. We just need to get a nice tapering shape in there. As we come on down, we're going to go ahead and get the wrist in. Now remember, this is the wrist here. This isn't the knee. This isn't a backwards bending elbow. The elbow's up here. The forearm is buried in the muscular tissue of the chest. The head of the humerus is going to be right up here. The humerus being the upper arm bone. So the head of the humerus is going to be right up there. That forms that top plane side to side is where the humerus is embedded in the chest tissue to help drive those downward hoofbeats. This here, wrist. So coming down from the wrist, again, we can't see the legs in this particular piece of reference. Not a huge problem. As I mentioned before, the leg structure of these guys, very similar to horses. We have that high wrist up here, that elongated hand, and then as we come down, we have the knuckle, and then the knuckle comes down to the joint. The joint terminates at our hoof. Now, the only difference between the giraffe and the horse that we did last week is this little change that I'm going to do here. I'm going to split that hoof. I'm going to come in here and just carve out a little piece, take a little pie slice out of it, and give ourselves a split hoof there. Because giraffes are what are known as even-toed ungulates. As I mentioned last week, ungulates are divided into two little groups, even-toed and odd-toed ungulates. Odd-toed ungulates have an odd number of toes. Even-toed ungulates have an even number of toes. Pretty straightforward. You know what, I'm going to rephrase that. It's pretty straightforward until you realize that there's actually ungulates that have a different number of toes on the front feet and on the back feet. Like the tapir, for instance. The tapir has, I think it's 4 on the back foot, 3 on the front foot. So it's like, well, where does that fall, right? As I mentioned before, the only rule with no exception is that there's always an exception to the rule. So there's always going to be, weird outliers like that. But for the most part, ungulates are split into 2 groups, even-toed and odd-toed. The giraffe is an even-toed ungulate. So there we go. You can already see how we're getting that very specific giraffe build to this construction form, but we haven't really changed the forms up that much from last week. But it looks drastically different from last week. The forms are all there. They all have the same integrity to them, the same shape integrity that we had last week. The difference is the way that we're uh, angling them, for instance, tilting the shoulder mass a little bit more. The difference is the proportions, that shorter, more squatter barrel shape in the middle, the longer, more stretched out legs. All of these things work together. Remember, it's not just about making one area a little more extreme or one area a lot extreme. Sometimes it's small increments in several different areas. And through those small increments, the sum total of those small changes equals one large change, right? So tilting this chest back, getting a larger size to that wedge shape, shortening up the barrel shape, all of these changes together, working with one another, is what makes this a giraffe. That's what makes it this creature. So remember that too with creature concepting as well. If you're applying these principles to creature concepting, remember that little shifts in several areas will equal large changes. You don't always need to do one giant drastic change to a creature. There's this idea that when you're concepting up a creature or a monster or something like that, that you need to push everything to the extreme, right? Make it look crazy, make it look different, get as weird and wild as you can, and that's true. You want to think like that. You want to push the envelope a little bit, but remember that that doesn't mean leaning heavily in just one direction. You can move subtly in several different directions with that design and end up with a just or more impactful design than if you were to lean heavily in one direction. So think of it like, instead of going with just like one giant arm, right? You go ahead and you increase one arm size a little bit, decrease the other arm size a little bit, maybe tilt the head a little, and you can get like a crazy, mutant Frankenstein kind of monster vibe from all these little changes instead of doing just one big change. A lot of times we forget about that sum total. We think it has to be just all down to the one little thing that the one little change that we got to make. All right, so there are our hooves. Forelimbs are established. Let's go ahead and get those hind limbs in there. Hind limbs, we got our ankle coming in, are about the same height as our wrist on the front. Come down here with a really nice sweep down to that ankle. I'm going to pull this beautiful S curve just straight on down. So along this whole edge, I like to just kind of pull an S curve. Oh, I meant to do a red there, but that's okay. Let's do this fun little teal instead of red. I like to pull this nice little S curve all the way up from the corner of the hip here all the way down to that hoof. So we can just get a really beautiful flow to that whole shape right there. And we can counter that with two beautiful C curves, right? We have this nice stretched S curve on the front, then a C curve here, and another C curve here. Two C curves coming on down. Go ahead and raise that knuckle up just a little bit higher, that joint. There we are. Same deal, split the hoof, bring it on back. Can actually get a little more space there. Got a little too dainty. If you ever see that an area is off too like that, and you will always have something that's off somewhere, right? If you find an area that's off after you lay it in, don't kind of wait to, if you know it's off, don't wait to put something else in there, because every little, just as we were talking about, every little change with those proportions makes a difference. Every little mistake can go ahead and kind of cause a little bit of a snowball effect, because each mark that we lay down is dependent on the neighboring marks. So if something is off, as soon as you notice it's off, just, swallow your pride and get it gone. Erase it out and fix it. It's usually the only thing that ever kind of keeps us from changing things, right? Pride. Either not wanting to admit that it's off, or maybe being really proud of the work that we did, but it's in the wrong spot, right? Pride's a tricky thing like that. There we go. Nice. Let's go ahead and get that far leg in there as well then. Same idea, nice S-curve here. And we can do a C-curve. I'm just going to pull all the way through as if I can see the other side of those hips. And we can do a C-curve out to another C-curve. A little flat in there between the two. A little straight. There we go. And we've got our far hoof established. There we go. There are the limbs on our giraffe here at this point in time. So as you can see, we stretched and pulled those limbs a little bit further. And now, like I was talking about, as we're looking at this, we can see the sum total of the changes now. Before, we definitely saw the difference between that canid form that we started last week and this form just by changing those three construction forms. By getting a little bit smaller on the hips, a little bit shorter but thicker in the midsection, and larger in the chest area, we saw that change. But when combined with those legs, we can now really see it taking effect. Kind of a cool little thing there, right? So now what we're going to do here is go ahead and get that neck in there. And as soon as we get that neck in there, you're really going to see everything locked together here. Because again, that's the final piece of this puzzle. Let's go ahead and get that in here. I'm going to go ahead and turn the head just a little bit, just for the sake of the drawing, to get a little clearer construction to it all. Giraffe head is fairly simple in construction. I'm not going to go too much into it right now. We do have a whole lesson on head construction. But we're going to do a little bit here. Keeping those eyes pointing out to the side, making sure that we get that flexible muzzle with that little prehensile lip at the front. An orb shape that we're pulling out at the end to get that little lip. We have our little bump in the middle here, that little third ossicone. Now the ossicones, when I use that term, what I'm referring to are those weird little nubs on the top of a giraffe's head. Those little bizarre shapes that I'm drawing in right now, these guys right here are ossicones. And that's just a fancy word for skin-covered horn. That's all that it is. The males have a subtle third ossicone, this little bump right in the middle of their head that gets larger as they become more mature and older. Until you get like these ones that have these really big kind of gnarly shapes in the middle of their forehead. Really kind of fun looking on the older males. A lot of character to them. The ears are just kind of like funnels, paper funnels. But again, this is just a really quick review of that head construction. We're going to be getting into that in a little more detail on week 4, I think it is. Maybe it's week 3. Week 3. I'm already thrown off here. We're already on week 2. It's crazy. All right, so now we're going to come on down and get that neck in there. So the neck is going to fit right into this chest region. But it's not just a straight neck, right? We have a bit of a plane change here on the bottom, and we want to acknowledge that. We have it coming up straight, and then it cuts in a little bit and moves up. There we go. So watching for those subtleties. Again, at this stage, when we start manipulating these forms, when we start really paying attention to these shapes, we can get those subtleties that make this into its specific species. This can read as a southern African giraffe. We can get specific right down to the species. Now, I'm going to do one thing. That head's way too big right now, so we're going to shrink that sucker down. Bingo, that is much better. Just like that hoof that I was doing before. If something's in the wrong spot, if something's the wrong size, you got to change it. That always sticks with me. Jeff, at one point, when it really got through to me, was pretty early in my studying at the atelier. I was maybe here for maybe 2 years or something, and as a student, and I did this portrait painting that I was incredibly proud of at the time. I locked in the eye, and it was I hadn't moved on to the finishing stages yet, but I got this eye that was just that I thought was just beautiful. And Jeff came up and was giving me this great critique and was talking about how I should shift the temperatures in this one area. And then in the middle of his critique, he goes, "Oh, and this eye's in the wrong spot," and he just put his thumb right on it and wiped it. And he's like, "So you got to move that," and he went on and started talking about everything else. And at the time, I was crushed. I was like, "Oh my God, I love that eye." But he was totally right. If it's in the wrong spot, it's in the wrong spot. If something's off, you got to fix it. Remember, your piece is only as good as its weakest section. So we want to make sure that we're being as accurate as we can be with all of this. There we go. Cool. So we got that nice neck established now. Again, paying attention to those really subtle nuances of form that we need in here. Let's see. There we go. Looking good. Now I'm just going to go ahead and add a little bit of topography in here as well. Nope, hit the wrong tap combination and made that mark disappear, unfortunately. Easy to get back in though. Just a little bit of topography. And now the next thing we want to do is go ahead and start streamlining certain areas of this. So we've got our forms established. This is clearly a giraffe. We have those longer legs, deeper chest, more truncated midsection. That head is still a little big. There we go. That's better. We have our small head and long neck now supporting that. So definitively a giraffe. But how can we go ahead and push this even further? Is there a way to push these construction forms farther than we already have? Yes. What we're going to start doing now is streamlining these forms, kind of de-roboticizing them, right? So when we start with these construction forms, everything looks kind of chunky, blocky, big, and bulky. And what we want to do as we move forward is start to streamline those forms. So now that we have everything down and locked in, our puzzle is put together, we can go ahead and start rounding these forms out. Like I said, de-roboticizing them. What I like to kind of think of it as is almost as if we have a big wooden block, right? It's almost like what we're going to do now is basically take the big wooden blocky forms that we've established. Here we go. Here's our big wooden block. And we're going to go ahead and take some sandpaper to these corners. And we're going to sand off these corners and just round them out. Get more organic with these forms. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like in practice, right? We've just saw conceptually what we're going to do. In practice, what does that look like? We're going to come in here now. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on the reference so you can see things maybe a little more clearly here. We can see the calloused areas of that elbow on the reference that's kind of sticking out a little bit right here. I'm going to start adding on areas like that, areas of soft tissue. What this is in here is the built-up callus of the elbows, like I said. When they lie down on the ground, they get these kind of rough pads right here on their elbows, and actually on the underside of their body as well, where it touches the ground so that they can kind of, take that little bit of roughness there. It's just calloused, built-up skin. So here we go, adding on that soft tissue, and getting a little, like I said, a little less robotic here, following the curve of the triceps up. The triceps are on the back side of this wedge shape. And we can go ahead and start adding in as well a little bit of value. And this is what I want you to do for your assignment today. So for those of you who wish to kind of take a more naturalistic route, you have a bit of a two-part assignment. You're going to start by taking the reference provided and drawing the construction form like we have here. Pushing your forms, exaggerating them a little bit more, and finding the specifics of those forms that make it this creature type. For those of you who want to go in a more conceptual direction, what you're going to do is take the other piece of reference. So you're going to have a giraffe piece of reference, and the other piece of reference is going to be a big cat. For those of you going in the other direction, what I want you to do with that big cat is create a drake. A drake, in this situation, we're going to define it as a flightless dragon. So I want you to go ahead and take that cat structure that you have, or the cat reference, switch the construction forms up just enough to kind of go ahead and give it a little bit longer neck, maybe a little bit of an S curve in that neck, similar to, say, a snake or something along those lines, or maybe like a raptor from Jurassic Park, right? Stretch that neck out. Go ahead and give it a more draconian tail. Now, don't render it up. I don't want to see a final rendering. I don't want you to try to impress me with finishing skills here. That's not what this class is about. This class is about working to understand how to utilize these forms to create more dynamic creatures. So what I want you to do, if you're going to go ahead and do the conceptual way, like I said, reimagine the construction forms of that big cat as a drake, as a flightless dragon. Don't go designing out a flightless dragon. Just show me what the construction forms of one would look like utilizing that, that cat form, that cat reference. Now, that's going to look different for different people, right? Everybody's going to have a different interpretation of how they want to play up those features. And that's good. That's what I want to see. Do your thing. Do what you feel would look like a cool construction form for that, as far as the drake goes. And I'm going to go ahead and, like I said, during the critique videos, critique each and every one and kind of show you what works, what doesn't work, and all of that. So don't be afraid to kind of wade into those waters if concepting is really what you want to do here. But so what you're going to do is kind of bring that drake up to sort of the level that I'm working this giraffe up to now, at the point that this giraffe will be at when I finish it. For those of you who, like I said, want to do more of a real-world basis, you've got a two-parter here. You're going to do the giraffe, draw the giraffe up at a construction form like I am now, but you're also going to alter its stance a little bit, and I'm going to show you how to do that in just a moment. Right now, we're getting into those subtleties of the form, still de-roboticizing, adding in a little bit of value first. All right. So now I'm coming in here, like I said, just getting a little more subtle with those shapes. Paying attention to the specific curvature of some of these areas. Coming down here to the split in the pectorals as it comes down to those legs. Like I said, we have our little soft tissue back here. Again, you can see that we're not really doing a lot of detail. We're just refining. You know, I used that sanding, that woodworking analogy, saying that we're sanding the corners off of these wooden blocks. That's also the way I like to think of rendering these up. I like to think of it almost like we're whittling away at a wooden block, right? We're bringing it up layer by layer. We're adding information to it, carving information out of it, little by little. We're not trying to, you know, render up one area and then move to the next area and render that up. We're bringing it up as a whole, subtly, making sure that all those construction forms feel solid and lock into one another. Coming up here, just getting a little bit of a core shadow there on the neck. Again, just to push that form. So we have that nice deep chest there. Wonderful. Really such a fun animal to draw. I love drawing these kind of extreme forms. This is one of those animals too that on Earth that like if we weren't desensitized to it, that we would just think was insane. You know, giraffes and elephants. Those are the two things that that we're just so desensitized to because we see them so often. But elephants, like especially, like you couldn't you could put like 100 of like the top 100 concept artists in a room, and they couldn't come up with something as crazy as an elephant if given 10 years. Think about the way an elephant's built. It's a digitigrade that walks like a plantigrade, with this super short neck, with its nose fused to its top lip, with its canines pushing through its face. Like it's, oh, they're crazy. They're crazy animals, and we never quite appreciate them for how crazy they are. Really, just a wild design. Nature, it's just one of those things that shows that nature always does it best and craziest. Let the elephant be a good example of why you should never pull punches in creature design. Because nature will always design things crazier than you think you ever could. There we go. Look at that. There's our nice little subtlety happening here. We're now getting our boxy hips in there. I'm going to go ahead and just maybe apply a couple little highlights here and there. There we go. There's our giraffe construction form. So here is our modified construction form demo for the day. This is to show you guys how to push those forms, how to get them to weird and unique places. But demo's not over yet. We got another 5 or 10 minutes here. So for those of you who are approaching the giraffe, I have bad news for you. You don't just get a copy of the demo for the homework. Unfortunately, you've got a little bit extra to do. So what you're going to do is exactly what I did on the demo, with two exceptions. The piece of reference that you have is a giraffe that's in profile. So the point of this class, as I mentioned, is to learn how to utilize anatomy in unique and dynamic ways, right? To go ahead and push these construction forms, I'm sorry, to go ahead and push your poses but through understanding of these construction forms. So what we're going to do, the reference that you're provided is a giraffe in profile. I want you to turn that giraffe to 3/4 view for us. In addition, if you feel up to it, I want you to go ahead and move one of those legs. Alter one of the front legs to be a little more bent. So what I'm going to do here is show you what I mean by that. I'm going to go ahead and just ghost this leg out just a little bit here. Now, utilizing the joint points that we learned last week and this week, I want you to go ahead and get comfortable with understanding how to move and pose these limbs. If you're doing the Drake assignment this week, you're already in for kind of a crazy assignment. So you inventing construction on top of utilizing the existing construction, that's enough of a challenge here. For those of you utilizing the giraffe, again, like I said, I want you to be comfortable changing up the poses from the reference. That's kind of the point of the class, right? So if with that in mind, what I want you to do is go ahead and bend one of those knees. I'm sorry, go ahead and bend one of those legs. Bend it at the elbow, the wrist, and at the joint. So remember what we've got here, right? Elbow, wrist, digit, joint. Remember how your elbows and wrist bend when you're doing this. Because that is, I know it sounds really simple and really, overly simple, but it helps. So we're bending at the elbow here, right? The leg right now is extended. So to bend at that elbow, now don't let this intimidate you. This is fun stuff. We're going to go ahead and pull this out here. I know some of you are probably saying like, how am I going to move this from the reference? But that's the idea. That's the whole point of the class. So we're going to bend at the elbow. Up here again, remember that forearm, or I'm sorry, remember that upper arm, right? The upper portion of the limb, the humerus, where it connects from the elbow to the shoulder. That's embedded in here. So we're bending at the elbow. And then let's go ahead and bend at that wrist as well. And then bend at the digit. And finally, apply our hoof. We can go ahead and get rid of that previous one. It's no longer adding to the pose, it's just making it more confusing, so we'll get rid of it. And we can add in a little bit of value. And just like that, we've now have a reposed giraffe. So I want you all, by the end of this course, by the end of this 5 weeks, to feel comfortable reposing, to feel comfortable turning the forms. So this week is where it kind of starts. If you're utilizing the big cat reference for the Drake, as I mentioned, go ahead and push and pull these forms to go ahead and utilize, go ahead and push and pull these forms and utilize our lessons learned today to create that Drake construction with the big cat basis. If you're more grounded in real world creatures, we're going to go ahead and utilize this giraffe, turning the profile reference to 3/4 towards the viewer, so we get to see a little bit of the deepness of that chest, right? And going ahead and bending one of those forelimbs, pulling it off the ground and bending it at the appropriate areas. So on this note, I want you all to, have a great time with these. It's a difficult assignment this week and maybe seems a little intimidating, but don't let that scare you or kind of, frighten you away from it. With the foundations that we laid last week, I have confidence that you guys will be able to approach this and kind of have a really good time with it. So, yeah, have at it. Have fun with it, and I can't wait to see the results. As we go into week 3, we're going to be flipping over a little bit and doing something that's a little more creature orientated, but still has benefits for those of you who are a little more naturalistic based rather than concept based. So this week, as you can see, we focused a little more on wildlife. Next week will be a little more on concepting, but still have an overlap that benefits those of you who are geared towards wildlife. So here we go. Have fun, everybody, and I cannot wait to see your week 2 submissions. Take care, all.